Hello and welcome to this edition of Trader Talk TV. Today we have Amar from PubMatic. He is the chairman and founder of PubMatic, and we're going to be discussing auction dynamics. Thank you for the wave there. Auction dynamics and moving into a first price auction. So Amar, welcome.
Great, thanks for having me.
No worries. So what do you want to talk about today in terms of auction dynamics and the first price auction debate?
Yeah, sure. Maybe it's worth just taking a second to set some context around how we are kind of arriving at this point, if you will, right? So if you think back long time ago, like maybe 2 years ago, where the waterfall was very kind of prominent, and now moving to kind of the newer world of a header bidding or wrapper type situation. So what that's moved, waterfall, we were in as kind of a serial mode where an impression went to one SSP, and then if they couldn't fill it, it went to another one, and then down the waterfall. Whereas now everyone's kind of bidding in parallel. And so that's had a lot of implications for the ecosystem, right? So for example, SSPs have more access to inventory now because there's not just one SSP live on a publisher. DSPs are seeing impressions more times. You have more bid density because more DSPs, more bids are coming in. Win rates are going down for both players. So all these things have really caused, as we all know, have really changed the ecosystem quite a bit. And so I think that's what's really leading now to this conversation about second price versus first price and communicating these kinds of details in the auction call, if you will, in the RTB request. So yeah, so that's I think a little bit of a context. Maybe it's worth, just so we're all clear on defining first price and second price.
Yeah, let's do that. That'd be useful.
Yeah, so if you think about first price, it's really the highest bidder wins, and the clearing price, the price that the buyer is being charged, is really the same as their bid price. So if the buyer is bidding $8, then that's what they're going to be charged. In a second price auction, the highest bidder again still wins, but the clearing price is being determined by the second highest bid. So the buyer's not necessarily being charged, what they bid. So I think that's kind of how we think about the difference between those two, and hopefully again that's relatively clear, but it'll be useful. I think we thought maybe it's worth going through a bit of a diagram.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And so, sorry, you were going to say something?
No, okay. Please carry on.
So, I think if you look at, this is a typical kind of second price, auction, if you will, right? So you've got the buyer's bid price here and what their willingness to buy, really their reserve price in second price parlance. And then you've got what they end up getting charged. That's the clearing price of the auction. And then this floor price is really what the seller's willing to sell at, kind of their lowest price that they're willing to sell at. And what you have in between is what we call buyer surplus or buyer happiness, which is effectively, hey, I was willing to pay 10, I'm getting charged 5, and so that's my happiness, right? And obviously the lower that clearing price is, the happier the buyer is going to be. The reverse is true for the seller, right? So the seller was willing to sell at 3, it's selling at 5, they're saying, hey, I'm happy that I got more than I'm willing to sell. I've got more than I was willing to get at a minimum. So now I think when you look at where, this is second price, what happens if you go to first price? If you just kind of go to first principles, I think there's sort of like 3 possible outcomes, if you will. So one would be really that the buyer kind of increases their surplus, if I can write. So that would be one outcome, and we'll go through that in a second. Second outcome would be that the buyer, we can call it, the seller increases their surplus. And then the third would be no change in surplus. So these would be sort of the 3 different scenarios. I have a red marker, so I'm going to try to use that too. So let's walk through each of these. So if you think about the buyer increasing their surplus. So if you go back to our definitions again, remembering that in a first price auction, and we're talking about first price auctions here. If you think about the first price auction, the clearing price is the bid price, right? So if we think about the buyer increasing their surplus, imagine that the buyer is able to bid here. So they bid here. And that equals the clearing price, as we talked about. So now, the buyer they were still willing to pay 10. That impression is still worth the same to them, right? So if in that example before, they were willing to pay 10, now they bid 4, and they get charged 4. So the buyer has increased his surplus, or her surplus. The buyer has increased their surplus. So that is one kind of scenario, right? The next one would be the reverse. The seller increases their surplus. Let me see if I can grab this marker for 1 second here. Where the buyer bids here. This is the new clearing price. And so now the seller's surplus has increased up to here. So this is the seller's surplus now. And the buyer's surplus has shrunk, right? So that's kind of a second possible outcome. And then the third would really be this idea that just there's no real change. The buyer just starts bidding here.
Everything stays the same.
Everything kind of stays the same. The buyer effectively says, I'm able to figure out where, what I was being closed at before, which they know because they're getting charged at, and I'm just gonna bid that. And so they just do it here, and exactly like you said, nothing's really changed. So I think those are kind of like the three possible outcomes. And just one other point, let me add. When you think about surplus is advertiser ROI, right? So when we had that buyer increases their surplus and they paid less, the advertiser ROI went up, and the publisher yield went down because the buyer captured more of it. In this scenario here, which is here, the buyer bid here and the clearing price went up. Seller surplus increased, as we talked about. That means that the publisher yield went up, they got more, and the advertiser ROI went down because the advertiser was paying more for the same impression. So before, they're paying more than they were before, so their ROI has gone down.
Yeah.
So I mean that's probably the way the advertiser and publisher would really think about it.
And when you talk about buyer surplus and the bid price, which is the buyer's willingness to buy, say that bid price is in a second price auction, that bid price is $10.
Yeah.
Is that buyer generally really willing to pay $10, or are they paying $10 knowing that they're never going to pay that amount because they operate in a second price auction, so it's the 1 cent above the bid below that is what they're actually paying? So is the surplus ROI really the same?
Yeah, so I think, most of the buyers or the algos on the DSP side are bidding what they believe that the value of that user and that impression is. And they're not always necessarily paying 1 cent more than the second price.
No, I mean, talking very basic.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of modified second price
absolutely.
auctions out there, fixed price, margins, depends on different kinds of models. But I think that by and large, most buyers are bidding what they believe the value of that, like I said, that user and that impression is. It definitely can be, there are cases where people are bidding really high just to test things out or whatever, but from our research and discussions with everybody, I mean, that's on the order of a couple percent. That's not the majority, because they know that they could be charged that amount.
Of course, yeah.
So it's not really like a viable strategy to keep just bidding absurdly high, and then expect not to pay anywhere close to that, So I think that this also then has like a few important implications for buyers and sellers. So I think, there is a little bit of it's the new thing, and there's a lot of conversation about first price, but it does change some of the rules of the game, and, I think in the short run, it feels like it could help sellers increase their yield. Publishers can increase their yield and make more money. But there's a flip side of that, was advertisers will pay more. And I think that in the long run, it's not clear that it's first price is necessarily a great thing, and I'll kind of mention 2 points around that.
Yeah.
So one is for publishers, right? So publishers, I mean, at PubMatic, we're sort of generally, we're publisher focused.
Of course.
So publishers today, they get to see all the demand coming in. Publishers get to see all the bids and the reserve price bid. So they get to see that advertiser A is willing to pay $10.
Yeah.
and they can see how many times they're willing to pay that and on what users. So they really, it's almost like sales strategy. Like if you think about your programmatic sales strategy, you get to see all the demand coming in your front door. I mean, you kill yourself to know that in the direct world, right? You're negotiating with an advertiser and you're like, how much could they pay? And how much budget do they really have? Well, you actually get to see that in the programmatic world every day. You get to see that in their bids. And that's true in the second price world because the buyer is bidding their reserve price. But if you think about it in a first price world, the buyer is going to do what we call bid shading, which is that they're going to shade their bid or shill their bid to essentially put in a price that's lower because they know again that that's what they're going to be charged. That's what these lines that we were talking about, right? So they're going to say, well, I was willing to pay 10, but I'm going to bid 6 now because I know that that's what I'm going to be charged, And so all of a sudden now the publisher doesn't have a complete view of the world anymore. They really just get to see that $6 bid.
Yeah.
And they don't know anymore if the buyer was willing to pay more and how much more and on which users, etc. So they're really getting a obfuscated view of the world now in terms of the demand picture. So we think that there's a lot of value for publishers to really think this through and think about should I close the auction on my end, and maybe I'll get to that in a second, but to really think about how do I make sure I still have a full view of the demand of out there. So I think that's kind of one thing that publishers really should kind of think through. And then for buyers, agencies, DSPs, etc., I mean, today when they make a bid, that bid comes to some SSP who then conducts a local auction and then makes a bid to the publisher, whether it's a wrapper or the ad server or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
And the SSP has quite a bit of information, more information than the DSP, because they get to see the bids from that DSP, but from other DSPs, and then they can do a lot of work to understand they're closer to the end auction, so they have more information, and they're able to make a better judgment about where this auction is going to close to put the appropriate bid in. So, for example, if the buyer bids $10, the SSP is in a very good position to say, oh, this is a very competitive auction. We probably need to submit a higher bid to the publisher to win that auction to get the buyer's bid to win $8 versus $6, But the DSP doesn't have as great a purview. They have less information. So by being further away from where the end auction closes on the publisher side, they really are making a decision with less information. They're sort of guessing more. I mean, they have fewer data points to really make a conclusion about what this auction is going to be at. So I think that a first price world could end up harming DSPs from that perspective, where they're not anymore able to fully understand or fully make as educated a bid, into the auction. So I think that's an area where SSPs and the DSPs can work together.
So the publisher arguably has less information. The DSP has less information.
Yeah.
So who is winning from a first price auction?
Well, I think in the short run, where maybe some buyers and DSPs haven't built as much technology around this, you could argue that, yields are going to go up. But I feel like that's probably a relatively short-term phenomenon. I mean, I don't think advertisers are going to be happy to just paying more for no good reason, I think that is some real downfall of, a first price auction. There's an argument also to be made saying, first it's simpler, the buyer bids, they get charged that. I mean, there's less gamesmanship, there's less, kind of past decisions being made along the chain. So it's simpler in that sense, but I'm not clear that it really results in better ROI for the advertiser.
No.
And the publisher, I think, is worse off as well.
And everyone's favourite word this year is transparency.
Yeah.
Does moving to first price improve transparency?
I think that it could, but not necessarily. So I think that there's
it's not its initial reasoning for being.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that's really the core reason for it, and I don't think it necessarily does. Because I think a buyer's going to bid, and the same mechanics that go along, whether there's an SSP as a buy-side fee or not, or a fixed price or whatever, all those things are still going to be there to convey along in terms of sending that bid through to the publisher. So I really feel that it's not going to necessarily increase transparency.
Okay, interesting. And so from the perspective of the advertiser and the DSP, what do they need to do to make first price work more in their favor?
Yeah. So I think that's, so you're saying how to make it work more in their favor. Well, I mean, I think that it's probably worth testing.
Yeah.
But I think it's also worth thinking through, like, who are your major, if you're a publisher, who are your major buyers, or if you're a DSP, who are your major, the publishers you work with, or you're an agency or an advertiser, who are the sellers that you work with, and having a conversation with them, trying to understand, seeing, like, what are your goals? Is it more around ROI? Is it more around reaching consumers, etc.? So I think that's kind of, one thing. It's probably worth everyone running some tests. I mean, we've been running a bunch of tests around this too. But I mean, I think thinking through your strategy and then these fundamental points I mentioned before, I think are worth thinking about. Maybe it's also worth talking a little bit about how to think through a first price, second price, where the auction's closing.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of another important topic for everyone to talk about.